Where are we now? Our next item is Beth Albert is going to give us an update on the regional Network 10 homelessness. This is in response to a request by Delegate Lynch.
Thank you, Beth.
Okay, Beth, the microphone is yours.
Thank you for inviting us to come and give an update, or asking us to come give an update on the ICHH grant. What I've...
The button will go off.
Oh, okay, sorry. So what you're going to be getting in a second is a handout that I've prepared along with Alan Trebat, the regional coordinator for the regional network, to give you an update on the regional network ICHH grant to the Cape and Islands. So what I'd like to do is just take a minute to go through this briefly and then open it up for questions or comments. Is that all right? Okay. I'm going to wait till everybody gets a copy. So what I've prepared for you is just some bullets about the grant, and then a little bit some of the goals that we're working on, the progress on those goals. So the first few items are pretty straightforward: the grant terms, the total award, just some brief background on the ICHH, which is the Interagency Council for Housing and Homeless proposal. We submitted it as a region back in September of 2008. The state announced the awards in spring of 2009. And Barnstable County entered into a contract with the Department of Housing and Community Development in May of 2009. The original application put forward by the region was for $1 million, and we were awarded about 76% of that initial request. So some of the main goals in our proposal were a systems change for housing and homelessness on the Cape and Islands. We wanted to propose and test some regional innovations. We're going to talk a little bit about those, the telephone triage system and the Client Coordination Council. A big goal was to strengthen the coordination among the providers, the service providers around prevention services. We wanted to rapidly rehouse those who are homeless, and we wanted to build and strengthen a regional network. What I've prepared below that is just what our budget looks like. You'll see the first line is client resources, and notice that a vast majority of the money we did put into client resources. There was also a line item for a Main Street outreach worker, and I'm going to explain what some of these are in a minute. We have a network coordinator. We have some funds, $80,000 for a 24/7 homelessness crisis hotline, a part-time data administrator, and some money for training. Some of the things that made our proposal unique was that we did have a dollar-for-dollar catch match from any agency utilizing client resource funds for homelessness prevention. So what that means is if an agency got $50 and expended that on homelessness prevention, there was a dollar-for-dollar match. So we, in essence, doubled that client resource line, and that made our region unique. In addition, the regional network got together collaboratively in the spring and raised over $60,000 in a Home with a Heart fundraising campaign. The next bullet is the client resource expenditures. As of June 30th, we've expended $414,595 and have about $60,694 remaining for prevention services to the end of the grant. So we have that to spend in July, August, and September. Another thing that made us, well, didn't make us unique, but we did have a cash match requirement. And several of the regional network agencies, HAC, Duffy, CAC, and the county provided a cash match and/or in-kind resources contributions totaling about $140,000. So those funds are used to supplement and leverage the ICHH dollars, and they're for administrative support and case management support. So as the county was the convening agency, our role really is to administer the contract with the Department of Housing and Community Development, provide fiscal management to receive and distribute the funds, and also coordinate the multiple agencies and players in a collaborative fashion. So what's next is just progress on meeting the benchmarks that we set forth. And these were things that we projected that we were going to achieve when we wrote the grant. They were slightly tweaked when we signed the contract. So the first one I'm not going to read, but it was to create opportunities for broad-based discussion with diverse stakeholders and build a network. That was a big thrust of this grant, was to really build and sustain this network, with the hope that if we were better coordinated, more efficient, that we would be a stronger network and be able to be more efficient with the limited prevention dollars that we had. Goal number 2 was to reduce need for shelter and achieve housing placements. So to date, we have 120 individuals have been assisted with prevention funds or diversion funds. The goal for the grant was 93, so we did exceed that number for that deliverable. The next one is we've served 389 families with prevention or diversion funds. 205 of them were ICHH funded. An additional 184 families were assisted through the matching requirement. And the goal for the 18-month period is 684, so we're off a little bit, not a little bit, we are off with meeting that number. I don't think we're going to be able to get to that 684. We have had a 12% reduction in the average length of stay by families in shelter from 128 days to 112 days. We also had a goal to reduce family shelter units over the 18 months to 62. We've worked from 73 down to 68. And in addition, one of the subcommittees that we have, called the Main Street Initiative Case Management Subcommittee, there were 93 individuals identified last March as problematic in Hyannis, on the streets of Hyannis. And these were identified by the Barnstable Police Department and various other players at the table. And of that 93, 63 were homeless. And of that 63, only 12 of them were at NOAA shelter, and the remainder were in jail, on the streets, or couch surfing. So the majority of them were not in shelter at the start of that initiative. After providing intensive case management and case review of that original list of 93, 1 year later, only 12 remain homeless, and over 25% of those individuals who were housed now live off Cape or in communities other than Hyannis. And the last one was to reduce individual shelter beds by 20 from 60 to 40, and as you know, we haven't met that deliverable. And I just wanted to speak briefly about that reduction in the number of individual shelter beds, because that's, I think, the reason I'm here. One of the with all of the intense media coverage and the emotion that's generated by that. Unfortunately, I think a lot of that focus is kind of, the rest of the work of the regional network hasn't been showcased as much as it should be. But one of the benchmarks was this reduction of shelter beds. And that was, like I said, a projected number that we created in 2008 and 2009, and one that we thought was accomplishable, but unfortunately it hasn't happened. So what the regional network policy board, and maybe what I should explain to you, is we do have an executive committee and we have a policy board, and that's the group that makes the decisions about the direction and the policy that we're working on. So what, at our last policy board meeting, we want to discuss re-examining this issue, and we've decided to create a small working group to look more closely at the reducing individual shelter beds. and come up with some recommendations. I have been in touch, and Housing Assistance Corp does sit on the policy board as well as the executive committee, and have a commitment from them to sit on that committee with us. One of the other regions, because there has been some talk in the paper, some mention about other regions that have closed individual shelters, and there is a region in the Worcester Regional Network used a variety of funding, including ICHH funding, and did reduce their individual shelter population by about 50%. One of the key factors in the success of that shelter reduction was the fact that the homeless provider, SMOC, I think that's how you pronounce it, right?
It is SMOC, yeah.
SMOC, it is also a huge shelter provider and had a significant number of single room occupancy, or SROs. So they moved their individual clients from the shelter into SROs. So that was how that region made that a success. We don't have that capacity here, but I think we do need to look at that model and see what we can pull from that to see what might work here. We also need to look in our own backyard. I mean, there was great success with the Main Street Case Management Subcommittee and the work that they did with that original 93. So any of the lessons that we learned with that project, we should be looking at more closely. And what made that project, if I can speak for the success of that, is the case management component. And that was one of the in-kind resources that we received as part of the ICHH grant from Duffy and some of the other agencies that had those case management dollars. And you know, I neglected to introduce, there's 3 members of our policy board here, so I'm going to take a minute to do that. So we have Claire Goyer from Duffy Health Center, Estella Fritzinger from CAC, and Brenda Swain from Falmouth Service Center. I think that's it. I apologize, I should have introduced them first. So that's kind of it about the individual shelter and what the policy board's committed to doing. And we are committed to continuing to look at this and see if there's any way we can impact that situation. Some of the other goals that I just wanted to highlight briefly was we have a big data collection piece that's part of our ICHH efforts. And that's been a bit frustrating, but nevertheless, we've made some tremendous progress in the past quarter or so on trying to collect data, unduplicated data about the people that we're serving. And then the 4th goal was to implement systems change. And that was, when the ICHH came out, that was a huge component, was to propose innovations and see how you could test them in your region. And some of the ones I wanted to highlight was the 24/7 homelessness crisis, which is a pilot program, homelessness crisis hotline, which provides emergency response and referral services. I have the data from the first quarter of that project. And in the first 3 months of operation, the hotline fielded 151 calls. 38 callers, or 25%, needed overnight emergency housing placements. And the idea behind that is we're going to have an 800 number that people can call and then refer them to the right provider. So if you're calling from the Lower Outer Cape, you would be referred to Homeless Prevention Council. If you were calling from the Nantucket or the islands, you would be referred to CAC, and so on and so forth. So we've cut up the region depending on if you were an individual or family, and then using the main housing providers, Duffy, HAC, CAC, and Homeless Prevention Council, we've divided the region. And so there's cooperative agreements and MOUs with all of these agencies to take those cases, because you know, part of what we want to do is serve people in the community where they're calling from. Just briefly, the Client Coordination Council is another innovative innovation. And Alan's been working really closely on that, and maybe he'll speak to that a little bit more if you have questions. But it brings together over 60 case workers, advocates from more than 20 providers and state organizations to share best practices. And we've presented, the Client Coordination Council has presented trainings, advocacy, mediation, fair housing, reasonable accommodations. We're doing some trainings this month on trauma-informed care, and in September on harm reduction. So the idea is to boost the knowledge base of the people actually doing the work, and it also helps them network and connect with each other, and ultimately will have is having a positive impact on how the agencies are working together. ICHH also funded a full-time Main Street outreach worker in conjunction with CAC and council churches. By leveraging resources, we have been able to put 2 full-time outreach workers on the streets in Hyannis on Main Street, and with flexible schedules, and by alternating coverage, these outreach workers have been a very visible presence, and the feedback that we've gotten from merchants in the community has been positive. So Alan, I don't know if you have, well, should I can take questions now, and then we can wrap up.
Anybody have any questions for Beth on the information she's given us so far? Paul?
I have 2 questions. One is, what's your anticipation of where this new task force, you might be getting some recommendations from them?
Well, I think we just proposed this at our last policy board meeting. We are going to be pulling together a small group of people, so that should be happening in the next, I would say, 2 weeks or so. I can't tell you when recommendations are going to be made, but we are committed to kind of pulling it together quickly and starting to look at some of the things that we can impact and make recommendations.
My second question, what happens at the end of September?
That's a good question. So the grant ends September 30th. We've already started some strategic planning. We had a planning group that met several times. We have not fully worked out our priorities, but have several, like a first level priority, what we want to keep with the regional network, second level, third level. And so we're starting to look at raising some private dollars, because what we're hearing from ICHH at the Department of Housing and Community Development, which has been 0 funded for the coming year, is that if we come up with some local money, they may, and I say may, be able to help us out a little bit. So the regional network, the money that came in for the regional network is ending, but I think the group absolutely is committed to keeping forward. I think there's been tremendous project in building the network. We have a core of really committed people who have really stepped up to the plate and taken on, you know, like the 24/7 hotline. I know Estella at CAC, that's a very difficult pilot project, and CAC stepped up to the plate. Duffy has stepped up to the plate to provide the case management in kind and leverage some of the resources we have. So I think we're, as a group, really optimistic that we are going to be moving forward and continuing after the 30th. And there's also the commitment from my department and from the county to continue the regional network, although not with the prevention dollars that we've gotten, or the Main Street outreach worker dollars.
Well, it's very important work, so I hope that you do find a way.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with your statement that, you know, we should be singing the success of the Main Street Initiative in dealing with the 93 individuals and how they were treated in terms of the model that worked. And one thing that has, I think, overshadowed that is that, as you point out in the grant, all those who had signed on to the grant had committed to certain benchmarks, one being a reduction in shelter beds, because it was felt if the shelter beds were reduced, A, you'd be instituting a model that was working, so there'd be less of a need to service local folks, and and B, you would be kind of stopping the back door, kind of folks who just come because they learn they can get services here, and perhaps they wouldn't all be located in Hyannis if there were reduced shelter beds. What happened with that? I mean, if you're reporting to the state, as you have had to, and I understand there was a key role that maybe Alan had, I'm not sure who did all the monitoring. So you're reporting that there's no reduction in individual beds. Any sanctions for that? Were there any?
No, I mean, I think if you understand the intent of the ICHH grant, it was really to allow regional networks to propose innovations in systems change idea, and to test those, and to see what worked and what didn't work. And then the idea was to take what worked and try to replicate it. And so when I talked about, obviously there's some things here that aren't working, and in other regions, except we do have the 93 that did work. So the original intent really was to test out these ideas and kind of look at things in a different way, and attempt to start changing the system. How homelessness has been funded for years. I mean, there's money coming into the shelters. Unfortunately, as we got these funds to move forward with these innovations, we also lost some key prevention dollars. So there was a lot of things going on at the same time. But I think we can learn some lessons from the Main Street Initiative, absolutely, and maybe some other innovations that happened in other parts of the state, and look at that and see what we can take that may work down here. It is different. I mentioned the capacity issue with affordable, accessible apartments, and the SRO issue, which was why the success in Worcester.
Right, but there are also numerous other ways of providing single-room occupancy vouchers throughout housing authorities and throughout the Cape that I think, perhaps the grant didn't touch on as much as it could have. I'm concerned, though, that, one thing that happened through the Main Street Initiative was we brought together a lot of diverse agencies and interests to work together. You had the Barnstable Police Department, you pointed out. We had the Hyannis Civic Association, you had the Main Street Business Improvement District, you had the Hyannis Area Chamber of Commerce, the court system, the DA's office, were all sitting around, and a large degree of cooperation was all built on trust, that they were there because they trusted that certain aspects of this grant would be implemented. And when you have something like, a shelter commitment to reduce 20 beds, and then you hold your own meeting to tout, and I assume went over many of these same things at the meeting on July 10th, and it's announced that, no, we're not reducing any beds, that wasn't our commitment, and walk away from it. I'd be very concerned about that trust factor that those same groups are going to have of marching into another grant or signing off on other stuff. I think we all love the model that was there, that model, and would like to see that worked more, because we think that not only takes people off the streets, but really leads them on a road to recovery and into productive lives. The fact that only 12 are still homeless, I think, is, compared to all the other programs I've seen, is really something, to be proud of. So I'd be concerned about that trust factor. But I guess what I'm really wondering is, from a personal perspective with you too, what have you learned about what works? I mean, I attended the hearing where we heard the sheltering system is expensive. It's a model, it's an outdated model. We've got this housing stabilization model, which appears to be what, the Main Street Initiative was modeled after. That's working. How, as policymakers and as those on the front lines doing this, well, have you chosen a model or a mixture of the models, and how do you make it work in the future to help this regional problem?
I can just speak to that really briefly, and then Alan can chime in. But, I mean, the things that we see just really generally that work are prevention works. And one of the things I attached to your handout was the five years of the point-in-time count, and if you look at those numbers, that you'll see that the Cape, from what I understand, and I've only been on the Cape for 2 years, has been the leader in prevention. And so compared to other regions, our prevention work has been a model for the rest of the state. So I would say that's, from a policy point of view, prevention, prevention, prevention. And there are, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's very little, actually no prevention funds coming directly onto the Cape that I know of from the feds or the state, besides what's already here for prevention work. And so we have people like Bob Murray, who's going to be walking 100 miles next week from Provincetown to Falmouth to raise money for prevention. The other thing that I think as a region that we've absolutely seen work is the case management piece, is for people who, if they will accept services, intensive case management is key to success. And also investment in permanent affordable housing is also something that I think as a region we can stand behind. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think those are really the key aspects. Those are really the key aspects that I would have mentioned as well, and that I think that both at a state level as at a federal level, there's a recognition that those are the key pieces that we need to have going forward. And I think so. Certainly, the regional network has been heavily involved in the prevention piece and in building a network where people collaborate, work together better on the ground level. I think the housing piece is incredibly important, coupled with the case management piece. And as you may have seen, going forward, we're hoping to support that by having the regional network become more involved as on the housing side with a new committee to move forward and looking at that long-term solution. It doesn't deal with it tomorrow. My understanding is, to get new projects in the ground and completed, it can take 5 years. But really looking at that long-term planning effort to work together regionally as agencies, to bring together the housing agencies with the service providers, to link them up, to make sure that those pieces are there, and then we need the case management piece. So I think it's pretty recognized, what the solutions are that we need to work towards, and it's going to take some time. But I think the regional network's committed to doing that going forward.
Have you been on the Village Green in Hyannis recently?
I've been on Hyannis several times.
Just because we have individuals down there who need services, and we see them every day, and we know outreach workers go and talk to them, but I haven't seen, from this, who is willing or getting to service those folks. And I think that's kind of my concern, is that we have all these agencies. We had $760 some odd thousand, and we still have individuals who, now I know they have rights and can refuse services, but it seems like collectively we should be able to come up with something that would help those folks. And I can't more strongly disagree with the, idea that we don't have enough housing stock. When housing authorities and Housing Assistance Corporation alone and Falmouth and Orleans and others have Section 8 programs or state programs, you can do set-asides, and we could take care of the 3 people that are on the Village Green from Chatham if they needed to go back. There's a way of attaching vouchers. The key piece, the piece I think is hard, in which we would look for cooperation from everyone else, is from the service provider piece. That's where providing the services gets more difficult. But, from my experience at the Barnstable Housing Authority, where we created hundreds of units just dedicated to homeless, whether it's 2 veteran shelters, whether it was Pilot House putting vouchers in there, whether it's working with, VinFen, whether it's working with DMH, the SRO mod rehab program that, we did several of. No one else is doing them. So, I would totally support, Bob Murray and his efforts to pull those other housing authorities together. But I think you have to draw those people in. I never see them sitting at the at the table. They're just not there.
I think we've recognized that.
And that's
exactly.
Well, you've had 18 months to pull them there. How many housing authorities have you visited?
We have been working. Sandwich Housing Authority has been involved. We are now bringing in. Now we're making an effort to really bring in the other housing authorities. I think Beth outlined I think Beth outlined what the focus has been over the past really 13 months of the grant, 13 and a half months of the grant, of what the focus was on. And I think recently the policy board, the executive board recognized recognized that we needed to do more outreach on the housing side, bring in involvement of the housing authorities, and that's why this committee that had been existing as a housing development committee in the old leadership council, we thought that it was best, the policy board thought it was best, to bring this committee back to life, expand the role to be a housing committee and include housing authorities, housing developers. HAC will be at the table, Barnstable Housing Authority, Sandy Perry will be involved, a very broad-based group.
It sounds bureaucratic to me. I understand the need for the committees and pulling folks together to talk about this stuff, but I think if you're the coordinator for 18 months, it would have, in my view, it would have been wise for you to have gone to each of those housing authorities, met with each of those, either boards or executive directors individually, and ask them for a commitment and say, what have you done up till now? Now, if the Barnstable Housing Authority turns around and says, well, gee, we've been, administering,
I mean, I think your point's well taken, and I think Alan's been on the job for exactly 1 month, and 1 year,
Well,
one
one
year
year.
today, not 18
Yeah.
months. And I think there's value in the fact that we've recognized where there's a weak link, and we're pursuing it. But your point's well taken. So.
Well, I would just follow up by saying, in your year, it would have been nice to also have visited Barnstable Town Hall. I think the town manager would have liked to have had a conversation with you around what the best way may have been to spend, your year. And that never happened, did it?
I was never asked.
And
And it
Yeah.
didn't.
or you're being paid $112,000. I would think you'd look and say, who do I need to talk to here? Who are the key players? And it's one thing to sit at a committee, and it's another thing to go to those very communities. I would like it if you had visited all 15 towns, because I think that would have been important.
Tom, I work under the direction of the policy board and the executive board of the regional network as their staffer. My salary is $6,250 a month. $112,000 actually was for a projected 18-month grant period. My grant period actually was shortened, so I just wanted to make sure that we had accurate information there. We're going to repurpose some of that money back into the regional network. That would have been if I was on an 18-month basis. But more to the point, I think I've been following the direction of the board and also following the ICHH and DHCD mandates to carry out what is in their work plan in terms of particularly carrying out the innovations that were chosen in the grant. Those innovations being the Regional Network Hotline, the Client Coordination Council, serving as a liaison. I had a lot of roles and building the programs here to keep the regional network moving forward, communications within the network.
Based on that statement, how would you describe your outreaches to reduce the shelter beds from 60 to 20?
That was not specifically part of my role.
You just said that you would implement the grant and to monitor those various things, and this is cited as one of the most important things that's there. And now you're saying, well, that wasn't in my role.
It's cited in the work plan, absolutely, and to the extent that my involvement, particularly in the hotline and in developing the hotline program, to the extent that contributed to decreasing individual homelessness, decreasing the need. In addition, the work I did to build the council, to coordinate the network, to the extent that contributed to reducing the need, it contributed to a reduction in people seeking shelter. And we had, again, Beth, I think, said, we had 120 individuals who were assisted with prevention funds who didn't need to go that route because of this. And I just, going back to some of what you were talking about before and what Beth was talking about in terms of some of the other factors that intervened when this grant was proposed, it's my understanding that it's this was put together back in 2008, and there have been fairly serious economic free fall since then. I don't have any data. All I have is all of our understanding that there was a very serious change in conditions in our economy over the past 2 years versus when this was initially put together. I don't know what role that played in changing the playing field. I don't know what other factors have resulted in changing the playing field here in addressing that need for individuals to have shelter.
One last question, Mr. Speaker, just for Beth. Beth, on the reduction in the family shelter beds, were those hotels, or were those actually shelters that existed for families where you took family
The
beds
shelter,
offline?
there are some shelters, what they call shelters, for families, and because of how families, because of how families, if they're EA eligible families, are directed by the state into shelters, there are some people from off Cape living in some of the family shelters, and so we've been working to reduce those numbers of referrals, and that's how we're going to be, that's where we projected to reduce the number of beds.
Thank you.
I know I have a couple of delegates waiting to ask a question, but I'd just like to quickly clear up something. Obviously, you have limited resources, so you want to target a certain population according to the intent of the grant. And I'm looking now, I guess, for the definition of homelessness. Who is the population you're trying to serve? I mean, as you described early on in your report, in the Main Street Initiative, there are people who are couch crashers, or people who may live in temporary housing. They're bunking in with relatives and so on. There's some people who may have housing but seem homeless because they're just kind of hanging around all day. I mean, how much do you target I guess would be the homeless population is defined by those who are forced to seek shelter and services, as opposed to those who are maybe marginally housed and maybe going in and out of the homeless population, and periodically. I mean, if I go down to the Village Green, I see 50 people there. I mean, how many of them are your clients, and how many of them are not your clients?
Well, I'm not a provider, so they wouldn't be my clients, but, and actually, the providers may be able to specify what the definition. I know with the ICHH, there were tier definitions, people who were, chronically homeless, and I don't have those definitions in front of me. To be honest, it was very convoluted and didn't really match the other definitions that HUD used.
If it was an easy question, I wouldn't have to answer it.
Then there was the whole, front door, screen door, back door. I mean, there was a lot of craziness going on. And as far as specific programmatic definition of homeless, I know that it differs between different ones, and maybe some of the providers can answer.
Try and field that very quickly.
Thank you.
With your permission.
Sure, but you're going to have to use a mic.
You want to?
I didn't mean this to be a long question.
Yeah, it's a complicated, I mean, I can't answer what the definition of homeless is for every program, for ICHH.
And I'm not going to do that either. Shakespeare once said, brevity is the soul of wit, so I'm going to remain very witty today. But the entire regional network took the breadth of homelessness and the prevention of homelessness. So it went from an individual or a family who was at the cusp of becoming homeless at any point in time in the near future to those who were chronically homeless, and that was the tier definitions, and those that are chronically homeless are pretty easily defined, and everything in between. So depending upon which project or provider you're talking about within the region would answer that question. There are about 25 different definitions, depending upon which federal agency you're talking to, of what the definition of homelessness is. So the region took it at its broadest base. What does the community need for those that are at risk of homelessness and those that are homeless?
Yeah. I guess the question is, and I'll get to Claire in a minute, is that if I go into a shelter, by definition, I'm reaching out for assistance because I'm going to a state agency in a sense. But if I'm sitting on a park bench in Hyannis and I'm sleeping in the woods, I'm not really asking you to help me. Basically, you have to come to me, or if you want to, or if that's part of your mission.
Correct.
So what I'm looking for is how far does your mission segue from treating the homeless who are accessing resources to outreach to people who may not be accessing resources, but you feel are part of the overall homeless population?
Again, the breadth of providers and the breadth of, in addition to that, something you're not even thinking of right now because we're really thinking about the chronic, and I think Claire can answer parts of that much better. There are also families who today can't pay their electric bill and may have to move out of their apartment based on that, so we looked at that too. Okay. It's the entire breadth.
Okay, Claire, and then
Thank you.
I'll give up the mic.
Claire, Estella Fritzinger.
There are two major federal agencies that really define homelessness, and as Estella said, it ranges from kind of a narrow definition, which is the Housing and Urban Development definition, which is very narrow and precludes the use of perhaps people who are couch surfing or doubling up. They're not counted as homeless. All the way to the Health Resource Services Administration, which has the broadest definition of homelessness, and I would say that's the definition as a network that we adopted. That includes people who they lack permanent, stable housing of their own. So they aren't sleeping outside, they aren't staying at the shelter, but they don't have their own housing to go home to every night. They're crashing at somebody's couch, somebody's basement, somebody's tool shed. They're moving into campgrounds in the summertime because they can only sustain temporary year-round housing. Those people who are really marginal and very hidden on the Cape, and there are lots of them, all the way through to the folks who resist services, stay out in the woods, don't use the shelter, are difficult to reach, but you have to go out and reach them. So our services throughout the network run that full gamut. So we're trying to work with folks who, they're sort of safe at night, they have a place to stay, but they're not stable at night. So we're trying to move them to stability. And we're trying to reach people who are very unsafe at night because they are not even connected to any kind of service provision. So there's various techniques you use in the delivery of services to reach out to that full gamut of people who are homeless. Then you add the layer of people who are at, as Estella said, at the very high risk of being homeless. And unfortunately on the Cape, that number is growing because of the economic conditions. So you've got people who are really one paycheck away from losing their stable housing. They're close to foreclosure, or they can't pay their rent, or they're behind in their utilities. So we looked at the entire range and used the broadest definition, and we tried to implement innovations that would be successful for all of those parties. And in some places we were successful, and in others we still have a lot more work to do. And the shelter bed reduction is an area that we really need to dig in more at and work harder at coming up with collaborative multi-agency solutions.
Yes, Claire, the chart that we have about the homeless counts from 2005 to 2010, I don't know if you've seen this.
Yep.
That 734 figure that's for 2010, what definition is that?
That's a good question. That's the HUD definition. That's that very narrow definition, and it's one night, one count on one day of 1 year. So we know that it never accurately depicts what homelessness looks like on Cape Cod, and that's why it's really kind of unfortunate that it's the number that ends up being out there. I mean, it does give us some sort of measure of how we're doing. If we're trending down, we're doing better, but it doesn't accurately depict the range and scope of what we're dealing with in terms of homelessness on Cape Cod.
On Cape Cod, the 734, how is that generally distributed in terms of the 15 towns?
It's every community. It's the counts in every community. Do you have it by town?
No. It's not right here. But
do you have it by town?
My agency collects those numbers, and I'll be glad to email them to you by town to the extent that we can.
I mean, I assume Barnstable, the town of Barnstable, has a very large number here.
Part of the reason it's larger is because the way the count
Because
is
of the-
conducted. Because you're counting shelters, you're counting places where you know people are going to because they're homeless. So then, yes, it skews that way. If it were a truly accurate count, homelessness is proportionate across all of Cape Cod. If the smaller communities have fewer people, but it's still a proportionate number. There's a handful of folks in Provincetown that have been struggling with homelessness for a number of years, and people entering homelessness all the time in Chatham and Harwich, and every community has the issue. That's why we were trying to tackle this from a regional perspective, because we know every town is struggling with the issue, and we're trying to keep people connected, engaged in the communities that they come from and have their supports and networks in.
Mr. Speaker, I have one more. Just, and Beth, you're leaving, correct? You're leaving?
No, I'm actually not.
You're not leaving? Oh, fantastic.
I never
Good.
left.
I didn't know that.
No, I rescinded my resignation in April.
Oh, wonderful. But, you know, in terms of the years that I've been here, which is probably spans this 5 to 10 here in the Assembly, there were a few years that there was a lot of money and a lot of people were coming in and getting money. And the last several years, it's been cut, particularly the last 2 years, to zero, that the county has put into homelessness prevention. And I, for one, have tried to get us to vote for more money and find more money in various places, and that has not been acceptable to the majority of delegates. But that is the key point, isn't it? Homelessness prevention and the prevention part of this. Now that this federal money is going away, is the county going to be asked to try and come up with some money to support homelessness prevention again? I mean, is that going to be something, well, you're probably going to be spearheading that, I assume.
Use the microphone, please.
I'm sorry. It's a tough question to answer. Because there hasn't been money for human service grants and we haven't been going through a prioritizing process, it would be very difficult for me to pick one issue and come forward with it. I think where our commitment lies right now, as of today, where I speak, as I speak, would be with, we've provided, one of the things with the ICHH grant is that we didn't take any administrative dollars, so there's been a huge part of my time invested in this, as well as administrative support. So for right now, we want to do what we can to do, continue that support, possibly do some collaborative fundraising. But for me to say right now that we're going to be coming forward and making requests for homelessness prevention dollars, I can't do, because in fairness to the process, and there is a process in place, even though we're not currently using it. In fairness to all of the other human service, I mean, as much as I'd like to say, yeah, we want to get homeless prevention. So I think we need to look at because there's a huge, wide range of needs. So.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of my questions have been partially answered, but I just want to know from the demand side of things. You're touting some great successes in the first year of this program, but you've not been able to factor in the increased demand for, everyone's a paycheck away from being homeless. You're not being able to gauge how much more demand there is for homelessness prevention and making your mission far more difficult than it was in 2008. Do you have any statistics for that at all?
It'd be on a by-agency
I was just-
basis, and I could speak very quickly that we just put a report in for my agency on one particular program to the state, and in the 6 months, we did double what we did in the full previous year.
Right, so as a region, collecting that information is important. Absolutely, that's a good point.
And secondly, and these are fairly quick questions, I hope, percentage of families that have children, do you have statistics on that? Because that's always been my biggest concern.
We can provide it. I don't have them with me right now.
Anything counted as a family.
Oh, you mean on the point in time count?
Anything counted as a family.
Or just in general?
I just think, when I use a general number, I mean, is it 20% of the homeless are families with children? Is it 50? Is it?
don't know if I can answer that right off the top of my head. I don't know.
Persons, I think in 2010 you have 228 individuals who are in the families. Versus 516.
Right, that's for the point of time count, but your question is more specific, and I don't have that, but we can absolutely get that to you. And I didn't prepare to bring that, I'm sorry.
And the last question is, I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years to go and serve the homeless at the shelter and cook dinner for them. And we always had to set aside a very significant portion of dinners for the working homeless. They would seem to be the most able to break out of homelessness. Do you target them specifically? Because, again, it was astonishing to me to find that many of the meals that we said had to be set aside for people that were not in the shelter yet because they were working full-time.
Just the quick answer to that, without getting into too much data, is that the client resource line item was the biggest line item on here, and that line item was for prevention. So those are working families who need maybe 1 month's assistance to not lose their home. So a lot of those prevention dollars absolutely were spent on people who were not currently homeless, but we want to prevent them from becoming homeless because we don't want them going into the shelter. So all of those matching funds that the dollar for dollar, the majority of that money was used on prevention, not diversion, not rapid rehousing, which were the other two, in areas, but absolutely on prevention. Yep, sure. I said sure.
We can't hear you.
The mic. I should follow that mic just myself.
I just wanted to respond. That's a really, really good question, John, and I think that's part of why we really want to form the NOAA Shelter Task Force, is to really begin to do a better job segmenting who's staying at the shelter, who can we target for a quicker move out of the shelter. Some of that work really needs to be done, and we know that there's been an increase in people who are working and using the shelter, and you're right, it would seem to be a no-brainer to start with that group. They at least have some resources to begin to look at ways to move them out and get them permanently housed. That has to be a strategy as part of the task force.
That would seem to be an efficient way to recognize
Absolutely.
Reducing demand for that housing.
Absolutely.
And if the economic climate changes, which eventually it has to, that might be a path to success for reducing the bed need for the NOAA shelter, which I think is all of our goals.
I think you're absolutely right.
Beth, just to follow up on the questions I asked you earlier, the reason I was interested in the definition of homelessness is because there's a lot of peripheral issues around this. I mean, there's people who hang. I agree with Tom. There's a lot of street people in Hyannis. They're a drag on. At least it's felt. Oftentimes they're a drag on the economic vitality of the region. But they're not all homeless. So I mean, I would like to get an idea of where you. In other words, you have to draw the line somewhere. You can't deal with all the social problems of everybody. You're dealing specifically with homelessness. And I can see where you might deal with a subset of the population that would be, because of their lifestyle, in danger of homelessness at some point, but they may not at this point recognize that.
Right.
So, I mean, how far do you go? I mean, do you concentrate the majority of your efforts on the chronically homeless population that accesses the shelters, or are you painting such a broad brush that you may be spreading yourself too thin?
Okay, so for the regional network, we have the big pot of prevention dollars, which would serve working families, anybody who was at risk of homelessness, okay? If they came to one of the agencies that had, the main, what we call client access points, or one of, like, the Falmouth Service Center or the churches, they would be ideally diverted into the regional network, served in the community that they were served with, get their prevention dollars, you never see them again, okay? And then they're, like, from the 93 on Main Street, when they actually looked at that number of who was in the 93, I had written it down, so I want to make sure Of that original list, 63 were homeless. And like I said, some of them were in jail, some of them were on the street, some of them were couch surfing, and 12 of them were homeless in a shelter. So the other way the regional network, so your point's well taken. I mean, not everybody who's out on the street is homeless. You know, they're just in fact, we have the data from these 93 that clearly show those people were not homeless.
Not everybody who's homeless wants to see you.
Exactly.
You know.
But the way that we really tried to pump resources into Hyannis was we have these 2 Main Street outreach workers who are out on the streets. So if there was a problem where a merchant thought somebody was, in front of their building, and the homeless outreach worker could come talk to that person, if appropriate, offer services and try to connect them. But not everybody's going to take advantage of that.
No, let me ask you a couple tough questions real quick. Just to follow up on an issue that's current, do you ever check the immigration status of these people, or feel that that's not, or do the
Once again, for the regional network, I can say, we're not checking this. There may be federal or state programs that require that. So I can't speak to what the individual agency policies are if they're using other funds.
Yeah, I'm just curious as to whether, some people, for instance, who come to the United States, and I'm not talking about families, so I'm talking about young guys who come in, and they would just assume make as much money as they can, spend as little as they possibly can, and
send it
go
home
back, and I don't blame them.
Right.
But I mean, if that's not an issue, it's not an issue, but I thought I'd bring it up because of John's question about the working poor. But anybody else have anything to ask about the regional network? Yeah, Leo.
I just have a couple of questions so I can understand this report. In regards to the client resource cash matching requirement, is that matching, do the funds match to the client, or are they matched to the agency that, like you're giving the agency, let's say 10 grand, you give the agency 10 grand, they match 10 grand, and it goes to the client, or does the client get it directly?
We did it both ways.
Okay.
We had an original pot of client resource money, and so there was an aggregate match, I guess is the best way to look at it. So if the agency spent $90,000 in ICHH funds, they had an aggregate match of $90,000 that they got from a variety of resources. We also put out just family prevention dollars. And with that, those contracts or those agreements, it was a dollar-for-dollar match. So if somebody was looking for $1,000, $500 would be ICHH, $500 would be from another source, ERA funds or HPRP funds or something else. So we did it both ways.
And I'm assuming that's probably the same thing with the catch match requirement on the last pod here too for this regional network.
The cash match was actually, like for the county, we put in all of my time was a cash match / in-kind. So the cash match would be if there were ERA dollars or recovery dollars that were used for a full-time position or a part-time position, we considered that a cash match.
Okay.
Okay. It's probably more familiar as an in-kind.
In-kind.
Right.
On the second page, in regards to the the 2 statistics there, the family shelter units being reduced, which we all talked about, and then the 93 individuals. In regards to the dates for the original numbers, and then I guess it says in here that these particular numbers were as of
6:30.
Okay. When was the start date, though?
Okay, so for the 93 individuals, it started in March of 2009, and the data was collected and compared through March of 2010, because that was kind of a special project.
Okay.
So the other, and that is confusing, I'm sorry. I didn't think of that when I did that. The other, the numbers or the percentages of reduction were from a starting date of May 15th all the way through June 30th.
May 15th of what year?
Last year.
2009, getting my years mixed up. Through June 30th of, 5/15/09 to 6/30/2010.
Okay, so, and just so I can understand this paperwork, that the 12 individuals that are listed as remaining homeless in the Hyannis Main Street area are now incorporated in the individual little gray block where it says number of homeless on the street 60. I'm assuming that 12 of those are the ones in Hyannis. I'm not trying to keep you to specific numbers. I'm just trying to understand this report. So if I'm asked to decipher
Sure,
it, people from Harwich, I'll be able to, you know.
So your question is that those remaining 12 captured in other parts of our report? And I don't know if I can answer that.
The gray area, I'm sure, is regionally, right? I'm understanding these boxes as representing the entire Cape.
Yeah, the point-in-time count was done in January, and I believe the 12 remaining on the Main Street report was in March, so, you know, they may have...
They're two very different things.
Okay, the point-in-time calendar, then, is that encompassing the entire Barnstable County?
The point-in-time count, yes. And
Three
the
counties.
counties.
Three
And
counties.
the islands.
Cape and Islands.
The only reason I attached that was because I had just gotten it, and I thought it was a good...
Oh, it's wonderful information. I just want to know what it's relating to.
Right. So let me clarify that. The point-in-time count, as Claire said, is taken one day every year, and it gives you a snapshot of what homelessness is. And I included it, and I am sorry if it's been confusing, I included it to show that over the years, there has been a trend down.
Right.
That's the only reason I included it. It has nothing to do with the first 4 pages or 3 pages of this, whatever it is,
Excellent.
of the report. So I'm sorry.
No,
It was
I
confusing.
understand it now. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I see some of the delegates yawning over here on my
Okay.
left, so that's a sure sign that this discussion has gone on as long. I don't know. Do you have anybody else who wants to add to this? I didn't mean to scare anybody away. Okay, well,
I missed my
you think you could come back at the conclusion, perhaps after into September, and give us a final report on this, and maybe an update on how you plan to extend and to what extent this program?
Yep, that would be fine. Thanks.
And do you know what the shelter population is for Housing Systems Corporation as opposed to what they actually have available? Do we know what percentage of the beds they fill?
I don't know what their shelter count is right now. I think it goes up
It
and
goes
down.
up
I'm
and
not
down.
sure if it's 100% every single night. I don't know.
Okay, well, just hopefully.
But there's 20 beds for a workforce program. There's 20 beds for men and 20 beds for women, is what I'm told.
Okay.
But collecting that data
All right.
is an ongoing struggle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any communications from public officials?
I'm sorry, no.
Do we have any communications from public officials? Communicate? Well, you're coming up next, just a minute. Communications from members of the public, there you go.
I can't resist this after listening.
You have to identify yourself, though.
And I've been working with the
Would you identify yourself
could you-
for the record, please?
Homeless Prevention Council.
Would you identify yourself for the record,
of
please, and turn on the microphone?
And I'm speaking from my experience as a member of the, I thought it would stay on, Homeless Prevention Council, the former interfaith group. And I was struck that in the discussion, nobody really mentioned the role of case management, because we're talking about people with mental illness, with drug and alcohol problems, and people who just don't have the capacity to steer their lives always the way we would like them to. So my experience with being on that council is the extraordinary work case managers do, often in a tough love way, but they stay in touch over the crises. They help lay out plans when people falter. They're there to support, to try to find a new way to approach it over years. You can manage one crisis, but then 10 months later, something happens to the family or the person, and they're down again. So they need this kind of consistent help, because there's no way you can cure somebody just like that. And for some people you can, but I do want to emphasize the case management portion of this. Otherwise, too, I do know what's been happening with the prevention money, with people who can't pay their bills, who lost hours of work, who are running short, families, individuals, everybody. And I want you to realize how the community has stepped up with this. Anybody who wants to sign a pledge with a homeless prevention walk next week, I've got a paper. But groups like, of course, you know, Lower Cape Outreach and the Chatham Ecumenical Council been so generous with their monies to help pay the missing rent, the electric bill. They even paid for a portion of the rent while a almost homeless person gets training at the community college or elsewhere to hold a job that will pay their expenses. So I think we want to give credit to so many of our organizations and individuals who also support these families and these programs. And it's a hard job. I remember 5 years ago up in Orleans, there was a man who devoted his cottage colony. He would take the alcoholic single men, and he too would enforce his rules. Some of them couldn't stay, but by and large, it was a lifesaver. He's gone. I don't know what they really do now. I'm going to go home and ask, because these kinds of resources that stick with people while they're going through this, hopefully, transition to a lifestyle that's self-supporting, we just need more people, more resources. So I just couldn't resist telling you what my thinking was, and thank you for your interest.
I think it's important to understand that sometimes
You might cut up.
the regional initiative is announced, and, you know, the state announces that it's going to match some funds. I think it's $800,000. People think, oh, well, you know, things are being taken care of. But in truth, it's still necessary to support all the original components, and the, you know, Chatham Ecumenical Council and the other groups that are reaching out, and now more than ever, because this money is gone and the economy is still pretty shaky. But okay. I guess if there's no other members of the public who wish to speak, we'll now convene the assembly, and we'll begin by asking if there are any reports from committees. Yes? Charlotte?
Thank you. I ask that this first page of the Cape Cod Commission Reporter be distributed to you, since it was the Economic Development Annual Review. I did not know how many of you received this via email. I do get it. And when I saw this annual review, I thought that you would be interested in reading it and seeing what they had done. The other item that I want to bring to your attention about the Economic Development Council is the fact that Paul Nedzwicki, the Executive Director of the Cape Cod Commission, and also in charge of the economic development portion of what the county does, received a letter on the 11th of June from the United States Department of Commerce, the Economic Development Administration, advising that the EDA had approved an application for $60,000 for the EDA investment to continue the organization, meaning the Cape Cod Commission and the Economic Development Council. It's for the proposed project, estimated to cost $120,000, is to be funded from the EDA's short-term planning assistance program under the Public Works and Economic Development Act of 1965. So they have received the $60,000 to go towards their SEDS plan. The EDA's mission is to lead the federal economic development agenda by promoting innovation and competitiveness, preparing American regions for growth and success in the worldwide economy. And Paul indicated that this money represents a handsome return on the EDC's $350,000 investment, with the real potential of ongoing dividends. There is a possibility that the Economic Development Association will make this an annual fund for the EDCs. And it could be come directly from the federal government with no state filtering at all. So there is a possibility of $60,000 annually to come from the government for this SEDS program. So when we ask about the $350,000 and how is it being used, I think those who are involved in it, and I know Teresa's involved in it, and I think Paul was involved in it too, that it's working and we're getting recognition from the federal government now on what we're trying to do. So I just wanted you to be aware of what was happening with the EDC. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, are there any other committees that have met in the last couple weeks? I don't think so. So I will go now to the report from the clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the table in front of me are copies of the approved budget. So for delegates who would like a copy, there is one for everybody, so please take them. And Commissioner Flynn mentioned the tour that Bill Clark is putting together, and I've been dealing with Bill as well, and I am going to be sending out an email to the delegates, and I'm going to ask that you respond that yes, you will be going, hopefully you will be going, it sounds like a great tour, or no, you won't be going, or maybe you'll be going. But I really, you know, I know that sounds silly, but many of you may know that you will not be going, and so I need a firm no from those who won't be going, and for all of the options that I just stated. But Bill has a bus. There are people from the League of Women Voters who will want to be going on the tour, so we need to know pretty much well ahead of time how many people are going to be on the bus. So anyway, you'll be getting that email, and I hope you'll respond. And if you won't, I'll hunt you. But, and then last, this is just a reminder that if you haven't gotten your nomination papers in, the deadline for having them the papers to the Registrar of Voters is 5 o'clock on Tuesday, July 20th. That's your local Registrar of Voters, and then all papers must be brought to the county clerk no later than 5 p.m. on Tuesday, August 17th. I'd be careful. I know, for example, in the town of Falmouth, the town hall closes at 4:30, so don't check with your town hall if you're going to wait till the last minute. Make sure it's going to be open on that day. And that's all I have, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Is there any other business to be brought before the Assembly? Yes, John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would cordially invite, along with my fellow delegate from New Orleans, Mr. Kanega, the entire Assembly to come out to North Beach on August 18th if you'll be available that day.
Okay, we'll send that out.
You want to, we want to get a body count on that too.
Okay. Are there any? Thank you. Is there any other?
Mr. Speaker, move to adjourn.
Second.
Second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, back out into the heat.